The struggle between Arabs and Jews over ownership of the Holy Land dates back more than a century and has given rise to 7 major wars. The latest broke out on October 7 when the Islamist Palestinian group Hamas, which is dedicated to Israel's destruction and which the US and European Union have designated a terrorist organization, attacked southern Israel from the Gaza Strip, killing 1,200 people in towns, kibbutzim, army bases and a music festival in the desert. More than 20,000 people had died in Israel's military response as of December 22, according to the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza. Here's your guide to understanding the conflict. 1. What are the roots of the conflict? Nationalism grew among both Arabs and Jews in the Holy Land, which encompasses what today is Israel, the West Bank and Gaza, after the World War I era collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the territory for centuries. In 1920, the war's victors gave the UK a mandate to administer what was then called Palestine. Intercommunal fighting in the territory was exacerbated by resistance among Arabs to Jewish immigration, which rose in the 1930s. In the face of Nazi persecution, increasing numbers of Jews from abroad sought sanctuary in their ancient homeland, where Jews have lived for nearly 4,000 years. In an effort to stop Arab-Jewish violence, a British commission in 1937 proposed partitioning the territory to create a state for each group. A decade later, the United Nations endorsed a different division. 2. What came of efforts to divide the land in two? The Jews said yes both times, but the Arabs said no. After declaring its independence in 1948, Israel was attacked by neighboring Arab states, and its wartime gains established the borders of the new nation. The Palestinians used the term Nakba, or disaster, to refer to this period, which produced an estimated 700,000 Palestinian refugees. 3. Who are the Palestinians? In a 1967 war, Israel captured, among other territories, the Gaza Strip from Egyptian control and the West Bank from Jordanian control. It put the Arab Palestinians who populated those two areas, widely known by this time simply as Palestinians, under military occupation, further fueling nationalism and resentment among them. A large majority of Palestinians are Sunni Muslims. 4. What is Hamas? The Arabic acronym for the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, was founded in 1987 during the First Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, against Israeli occupation. It was a spin-off of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist religious, social and political movement. It initially gained popularity among Palestinians by establishing a network of charities that address poverty as well as healthcare and educational needs. It later gained notoriety for a campaign of suicide bombings and other attacks on Israelis. 5. What does Hamas want? The main goal of Hamas, as articulated in a revised charter issued in 2017, is the destruction of the State of Israel. The document describes all of the Holy Land as an Arab Islamic land, and says Hamas rejects any option but its complete liberation. According to the revised charter, the group's conflict is with the Zionist project, not with Jews, per se. The original charter of Hamas said, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews and kill them. The newer document says, resisting the occupation with all means and methods is a legitimate right guaranteed by divine laws. An early September poll in the Gaza Strip and West Bank suggested that, if given a choice in legislative elections, 34% of Palestinians would vote for Hamas, versus 36% for Fatah, the main faction of the Secular Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, the former guerrilla group that made peace with Israel in 1993. 6. What's a Zionist? The Zionism movement, originating in late 19th century Europe in response to anti-Semitism, supported the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people in their ancient homeland. It was named for a hill in Jerusalem mentioned in the Old Testament. Since the movement has achieved its aim, today a Zionist is someone who supports the development and protection of the State of Israel. 7. What's the Gaza Strip? The Gaza Strip is a small enclave, bounded by Israel, Egypt and the Mediterranean Sea, where 2.3 million Palestinians live in crowded and impoverished conditions, most of them classified as refugees. For about a decade, Gaza was governed by the Palestinian Authority, the body responsible for limited Palestinian self-rule under the Oslo Peace Accord signed by Israel and the PLO. In 2005, Israel withdrew troops from Gaza and abandoned settlements of Israeli citizens there. In Palestinian legislative elections the next year, Hamas defeated the PLO's Fatah faction, which dominates the Palestinian Authority. After months of fighting between the two groups, Hamas took control of Gaza in 2007. Since then, Hamas has used Gaza to periodically launch rocket attacks and raids on Israel, and Israel and Egypt have enforced tight restrictions on the movement of people and goods in and out of the Strip. Israel has long maintained control of Gaza's airspace and maritime territory. 8. Why are there so many refugees in Gaza? Many of the Arab refugees from the 1948 war and its aftermath fled to Gaza. The descendants are counted as refugees today because no permanent solution for them has been found. Palestinians argue that in addition to thousands of the original refugees who are still alive, some 5 million of the descendants, in Gaza, the West Bank and abroad, are entitled to the right of return to Israel. Israeli officials disagree. They worry that with such an influx, combined with the nearly 2 million Arabs who are already citizens of Israel, the country's 6.7 million Jews could become outnumbered, defeating the purpose of creating a Jewish state. 9. What's the situation in the West Bank? The West Bank is a landlocked block of territory west of the Jordan River where 3.2 million Palestinians live. It's also home to about 500,000 Jewish Israelis living in so-called settlements established after the occupation began. And unlike in Gaza, Israeli security forces still have a fixed presence in the West Bank. Some Israelis argue that because the West Bank, which they refer to by its biblical name, Judea and Samaria, was part of the historic homeland of the Jews, Israel should annex it. The Palestinian Authority exercises limited autonomy in the West Bank, and Israel has overall control there, as laid out in the Oslo Accords. The agreements were meant to establish interim arrangements while the two sides negotiated a final status agreement. That was widely presumed to mean a so-called two-state solution, entailing the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. 10. What happened with the peace talks? In the years after the first agreements were signed, trust between the two sides eroded. Hamas launched suicide bombings and other attacks in Israel, and Israelis continued to expand settlements. Negotiators repeatedly failed to resolve issues standing in the way of a final status agreement, including where to draw borders, how to share Jerusalem, and the status of Palestinian refugees. A second intifada, from 2000 to 2005, was bloodier than the first. The last round of talks broke down in 2014. 11. What are prospects for reviving the two-state solution? US President Joe Biden was among the global leaders who voiced support for this idea even as the latest war was starting. But since the last big push for it, under US President Barack Obama, the positions of both sides have hardened. A joint survey of Israelis and Palestinians conducted in December 2022 found that support for a two-state solution had fallen to the lowest level since 2016. According to the survey, the concept was supported by about a third of Palestinians and about the same share of Israeli Jews. A higher percentage of Israeli Jews said they'd prefer to see a single non-democratic state in which Palestinians did not have equal rights. 30% of Palestinians said they wanted a single, Palestinian-dominated state. 12. What's a kibbutz? Several of the towns Hamas fighters struck were Israeli communities called kibbutzim, the Hebrew plural for kibbutz, which means gathering. A phenomenon unique to Israel, a kibbutz is a collective community, typically engaged in farming. The first was established in 1910, and today there are about 250 of them. The early kibbutzim were radical experiments in egalitarianism, with residents pooling all income and sharing it equitably, eating all their meals together, and sometimes raising their children in group houses. Today, many of the kibbutzim have departed from those practices, but they still preserve elements of communal living. 13. What explains the timing of the October 7 Hamas attack? Hamas didn't cite a particular reason, but the timing of the assault, unprecedented in its scale, was notable for a couple of reasons. First, it happened at a time of protracted Israeli infighting over a plan by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government to weaken the judiciary. Retired generals had warned that Israel's enemies might seek to exploit the disunity. Second, it came amid a diplomatic effort to seal a grand bargain in which Saudi Arabia, the richest and most powerful Arab state, would normalize relations with Israel in return for US security guarantees. Saudi Arabia wants an agreement with the US that would be as close as possible to a mutual defense pact, in which Washington would regard any attack on the kingdom as an attack on the US, to ease its concerns about Iran, which it blames for devastating strikes on Saudi oil facilities in 2019. Such a deal would further isolate Iran, Hamas patron, and expand the circle of Arab and Muslim countries friendly to Israel, Hamas enemy. Saudi Arabia put talks related to the deal on pause in the face of Israel's response to October 7. 14. Why does the US support Israel? After the Hamas attacks, to show support for its ally, the US moved additional warships, aircraft and troops into the region and expedited shipments of munitions to Israel. Since World War II, Israel has received more US aid than any other country, some $158 billion in assistance and missile defense funding. For the first 2 decades after its birth in 1948, Israel wasn't an especially close ally of America. The US drew Israel close partly as a result of Cold War calculations, as the Soviet Union supported its Arab enemies in the 1960s and 1970s. By the time the USSR collapsed in 1991, the US-Israel relationship had developed new underpinnings. Israel enjoys popular support in the US. American Jews, who became outspoken as anti-Semitism declined, expect Congress and the White House to keep Israel close. So do evangelical Christians, who believe Israel's creation foretells the second coming of Christ. Their Republican leanings made support for Israel, originally a democratic cause due to Jews' links to the party and Israel's early leftist orientation, bipartisan. Iran's Islamic Revolution and attacks by Islamists on U.S. targets, including those on September 11, tended to make Americans unsympathetic to Israel's enemies.